Dive into a dynamic discussion with me where I uncover hidden facets of school vouchers globally. I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. If you're interested in global education and education policy, please like and subscribe. So, school vouchers are increasingly common part of the United States education landscape. So, vouchers are where parents or guardians get money for their child to go to a private school. So instead of the child going to public school, the money that would have been spent on that child going to public school is put in the hands of the parents that goes to and then goes to private schools. And this is becoming a big issue. 14 states now have voucher programs of some sort, and it's that are near universal. So almost any parent could get a voucher in those states. And other states are starting to have more and more programs. Texas is starting a program, and I think South Dakota is. Tennessee and South Carolina are both trying to expand their programs. They're giving a lot of money to vouchers within the state schools, the state budget. A lot of money is going to vouchers. And sometimes this is also called ESAs, Educational Savings Accounts. It's the same thing. And there are all kinds of problems with this in the United States, which I'm going to talk about briefly, but I thought it would also be interesting to talk about the global landscape of vouchers. So vouchers is very much an American idea. It's been done in America more than anywhere else, across all grade levels. And in the United States, it's basically kind of a free-for-all. So students, there's very little accountability, there's very little strings attached for private schools to take this money. Schools can select who they vote. They get the money no matter what their test scores are, no matter what, generally no matter if they have a religious affiliation or not, they just get the money. That's not the case in other places. So the two biggest voucher programs both have worldwide, other than the United States, they both had accountability and a lot of responsibility for the private schools, and those turn out a little different than the United States. So I'm going to talk about that first. So Chile had what arguably is the world's first large voucher program, and that took place in 1981. And Chile at that time was under dictatorship, and there was very much this idea of return to values, and it was like that for many years. So what Chile found with this voucher program is that the test scores, which had been going up until that point, started to stagnate. They kind of just stayed the same. And there was increased inequity, which if you watched my video about charter schools, this is something we see a lot in school choice. The students who struggle the most, students who do not benefit the most, are those vulnerable students who are poor, maybe live in a rural area or have fewer resources. A lot of minority students, those are the students who struggle the most with vouchers. And if you think about it, it makes sense from a logical perspective, because if private schools can students who are learning the language, if schools can choose who they want to accept, are they going to accept children who have significant educational needs? Are they going to accept children who maybe need to learn the local language? Are they going to accept children who don't have the money? A lot of private schools exist because because there's a group of parents who want their children to be separated from people that they think are inferior. Not all. There are many private schools that are very much connected to the community. I think in the Catholic Church, their schools generally serve a lot of poor children and children from disadvantaged backgrounds who may have special needs or be English learners. But there are a number of schools that exist because parents want to have their children educated with a certain group of people. So this became a big problem in Chile. They noticed that the schools weren't improving and their education wasn't improving, and there was all this inequity. So in 2008, there was a big reform of the voucher movement. So a few things happened that made that change very different. So, first of all, students who were poor, who had low socioeconomic status, their parents didn't have much money, those students got extra money, extra voucher money. And that was an incentive for the private schools to take those students because the private schools could use that money. Private schools often struggle financially because education costs a lot. Other thing was that schools had to agree that they would not charge more than the voucher for these students. So schools could not charge, let's say the voucher was worth $8,000 US, that's about the price of the voucher here. They could not charge, let's say, $10,000 or $12,000. They had to just charge the $8,000. So students so schools effectively became like charter schools, these private schools. They could not charge more tuition than what the voucher was worth. And they could not select students based on academics. So again, they couldn't say, oh, this student isn't a good enough student, or this student has needs we can't meet. No, they had to accept the students. So in effect, the private schools became more like charter schools, which are publicly funded schools that only take money. They don't take private money. So what this showed was that there was an increase in test scores, but there was still major segregation. Again, this looks like charter schools, where there's become this segregation. But there was also an increase in accountability. So some of these schools became better because they had to, because part of the deal was that these schools had to agree to be monitored by the government, to have testing of the students, and to keep those students, have some sort of standards. And most private schools actually declined. They actually started struggling because now they had to take in these students, and a lot of the schools that could be selective and that could charge more money, that they could serve a clientele that was easier to teach and that had more resources. So that's Chile. That's one of the examples. The other example is India. And India is now the biggest country in the world. And India has a long history of both public and private schools. And traditionally, the public school system was not considered very good in India. And most families who could afford it, kind of like China, would send their children to private schools. Over 50% of students attended private schools traditionally. And so a law passed, and this law was very interesting because it applied to all private schools. Private schools could not say, "Well, I'm not going to take your money." They could not say, "We're just going to stay private and not take any federal money. That's fine. We'll just teach you we won't." For the schools to stay in business, they had to agree to this program. There was no opt out. So in every private school in India, every primary private school, every school for lower grade students, every school must reserve 25% of seats for students receiving vouchers. And the vouchers only went to students who were considered poor, who had low socioeconomic status, and there was also concern about caste, which is a very Indian thing. But caste is social standing. So disadvantaged students, based on this formula, students were disadvantaged. So now all private schools that serve primary school students in India, 25% of those students must be poor students or students from disadvantaged backgrounds taking this voucher money. They also had to agree to a set of pretty stringent demands by the government, including things like having a playground. That's something that a lot of private schools in India didn't have, but they had to have that. They had to have certified teachers. Again, this is something that, by definition, private schools usually don't have. Or at least they don't have to have. I think it would be very unusual in the United States to argue that a private school had to have certified teachers, because again, the whole idea is that the school's private. It does what it wants to do. And it had to raise those teachers' salaries and pay similar to public schools. It even had rules like you can't retain students. So if you watch my video on grade retention, that can cause harm, especially to poor students and students with disadvantages. So students cannot be held back. They have to go into the next grade. There were very stringent requirements with this. And so what happened was really interesting. The schools could not charge the voucher students more than the voucher was worth. So they had to take at least 25% of students had vouchers, which was a lower amount of money than the schools would usually charge. And because of this, and because of all these requirements that the schools now had, the schools could not, they struggled financially a lot. And so what happened was they had to raise their tuition for these private paying students. So what you might think of as middle class students or upper middle class students now had to pay a lot more to offset the low cost of these vouchers and all these requirements that the schools now had. So the schools increased in quality, especially for these poor students. These poor students got a really good education and it really benefited them. However, it indirectly hurt middle and upper middle class students, particularly middle class students who maybe had the money to pay the tuition as it was charged before this law, but then when the rates went up to accommodate the voucher, students could no longer pay. So a lot of middle class students went back to public schools. And so now, interesting enough, a lot of these private schools have mostly poor or disadvantaged students. So that's very interesting. It's something that was not expected to happen, but it happened. So did it serve its goal of educational equity? Maybe. I mean, it did help some of the most vulnerable students, but it also hurt many students. So there's actually a lot of controversy. I read some very opinionated editorials about this. People who really loved the idea or hated it. So, onto the United States. So the United States, as I said before, in the United States, there's very little accountability for these private schools, and there's very little selection of these private schools. Sometimes in some states, like South Carolina, the schools do have to apply to use these vouchers or ESA funds, but the process is incredibly stringent. Most schools can apply and get in most cases. So you have students going to these schools and you don't necessarily know what's being taught. You don't know what kind of standards they hold the students to, even student outcomes, because there's not testing required. Unlike in Chile and India, where you see that there was a lot of accountability required. And the research shows that in the United States, most of the time the vouchers are not enough to go to these schools. For a school to be a really good quality school, it's more than what the voucher is worth. Private schools that are really elite and have really good outcomes routinely will charge $15,000 to $25,000, whereas a voucher is anywhere from usually $8,000 to $12,000. So the people who use the vouchers, research has shown, or the ESA, call them ESAs, are generally people who already go to private schools, who have the money, and now they're just subsidized. Their education is subsidized. They don't have to pay as much to go. And so this is a case of richer students, or students who have more resources actually having more, and then that money going away from public schools who need it. So that's what the research shows about vouchers. And it does increase segregation as well, because there are parents who may not have the money if they had to pay full price tuition, but now they could pay a little bit and go to these schools, and so those parents usually leave. There's also problems with vouchers and church and state issues. Many private schools in the United States are run by churches. That's pretty common. And in the United States Constitution, there is a distinction between church and state. So there's all kinds of issues with vouchers. And we see from these global examples that the only way that vouchers really help, particularly the most vulnerable students, is with a lot of accountability and a lot of rules around them. And the United States doesn't like rules in education. That's part of the argument that's going on right now about the Department of Education. There's this idea that schools should be able to do what they want to do and not have somebody from Washington tell them what to do. So I don't see vouchers or ESAs working in this country unless there was some major change. I could be wrong. And maybe as this program is expanded, it will become different. Maybe there will be more accountability, and maybe that will lead to some help for the students. But the way it is right now, the research shows that it will be like Chile in the 1980s and 1990s, and just be a segregated way for students, particularly richer students, to have a good education at the benefit of the poor, fortunately. And so if you've had comments, if you've been part of an ESA or your state does things a little differently. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below. Or your country does things differently. Please comment below. And thank you so much. And please like and subscribe if you're interested in this content. Until next time, keep learning.